Hello everyone, I am Dark Tales, and I am here to help you. Today I know you need to this video for a sleep. Before that, like the video and subscribe. The Dark Tales also, where you from and what time you watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Let's start at the second part of the Haunting House novel. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps, her hands trembling as she clutched the cold metal of the door handle. It was as though the house itself had sensed her fear, feeding on it, drawing the tension in the air thicker, tighter. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, stretching into dark, unnatural shapes that swayed with a life of their own. She could feel the walls closing in, hear the faint whispers that grew louder, more urgent. "Eleanor," they murmured, so softly that they were almost drowned by the beating of her own heart. She turned, her eyes darting frantically over the room, expecting something, anything to move. The air was thick, suffocating, and the stillness pressed in on her like a physical force. But there was no sign of anyone. The room was empty. Just the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet and the eerie hum of silence that filled the space. Yet Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something was watching her from the shadows. A low groan echoed from the far side of the room, and Eleanor's body stiffened. She didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The noise came again, faint, like a far-away wail, distant, yet full of despair. Eleanor's chest tightened, her breath hitching as the sound seemed to creep closer. There was no mistaking it now. It was coming from the walls, a mournful cry, laced with pain. Her mind raced. Could it be a figment of her imagination? A trick of the house, the product of a restless mind? She wasn't sure anymore. The longer she stayed in Hill House, the less certain she became of what was real and what wasn't. The boundaries between the physical world and the strange, oppressive forces in the house seemed to blur. She turned toward the door, her fingers already reaching for the handle, but before she could grasp it, a loud thud sounded from above her. The ceiling rattled, the floor vibrated beneath her, and for a fleeting moment Eleanor thought she saw the entire room shift. The air grew colder, as if the house had exhaled, and she could see her breath in the dim light. A coldness unlike anything she had felt before, a biting chill that sank deep into her bones. Her heart raced and her instincts screamed at her to run. But where? She wasn't sure where she could go anymore. The house was a labyrinth, twisting and turning, offering no clear escape. The heavy silence was interrupted by another series of thuds, closer this time, coming from the staircase. Eleanor's eyes widened. Was someone coming? The sense of being watched grew stronger, the pressure in the room mounting until it felt as though she was suffocating. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of the situation. She had to be imagining things. There was no one there, no one except her and the oppressive weight of Hill House. But the thuds came again, and they were unmistakably human. Heavy footsteps, slow but deliberate, as if someone were carefully making their way down the stairs. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat and she stepped back from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps paused just outside the room, as if someone was waiting. Then a soft whisper, just a breath of sound, came from behind her. Eleanor. It was faint, almost too faint to hear, but it was there. The voice, low and haunting, seemed to come from all directions, surrounding her. She spun around, her heart leaping in her chest, but there was no one there. The room was empty. Again. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and Eleanor froze. "Eleanor, you can't leave." Her pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out on her skin. She backed away, her mind racing, her thoughts jumbled in confusion. She had to get out. She had to escape this place, this madness, this whatever it was. But she was trapped. Trapped in Hill House, with its endless corridors, its shifting walls, its ever-watching eyes. Suddenly, the door behind her burst open with a violent crash, and Eleanor stumbled backward in shock. The room beyond was dark, filled with an overwhelming sense of foreboding. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like lead, her feet rooted to the floor, and her mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The door swung wide as if inviting her in, beckoning her forward. but there was something in that darkness. She could feel it. The whispering voices grew louder, filling the air all at once. "Eleanor, come to us." They weren't her own thoughts anymore, not her own mind anymore. They were the house's thoughts. The whispers of Hill House seeping into her consciousness, pressing on her, suffocating her. Her fingers brushed the cold doorknob, and for a split second she felt the presence of something ancient, something powerful and alive, just beyond the threshold. She didn't dare open the door. She couldn't. Then, as quickly as it had come, the door slammed shut, rattling the frame, the sound deafening in the stillness. Eleanor gasped, stumbling backward again, nearly falling. But the shadows were closing in. She could feel them wrapping around her, drawing her deeper into the house, into the darkness. She was sinking, drowning in it, and the more she fought, the deeper she went. The lights flickered, the room plunged into darkness, and the whispers grew into a cacophony, a shrill chorus of voices, all shouting at once. She clutched her head, trying to block them out, trying to steady her breath. They were inside her mind now, inside her head. In the distance, she thought she saw movement. A shape just on the edge of her vision. It was fleeting, like a shadow passing by too quickly to catch, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. She turned her head sharply, but there was nothing there. Then a voice rang out, loud, unmistakable, and terrifying. "You cannot leave, Eleanor. You are ours." Eleanor's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, her eyes wide with terror, her breath ragged. The house was alive. It was breathing, watching, waiting, and it had claimed her. For a moment there was a stillness, a silence that rang louder than any sound. The house was waiting for her to make her move, waiting to see if she would fight back, and then, as if in response to her fear, the shadows began to move, slowly, shifting and twisting, forming shapes in the dark corners of the room. Eleanor's eyes darted to every corner, but there was no escaping them. They were everywhere. The shadows closed in on her, pulling her toward the center of the room, toward the center of Hill House. And then, just when it seemed the walls would close in on her entirely, the door to the hallway creaked open. But Eleanor didn't want to move anymore. She was frozen in place, her limbs heavy, as though the house itself had a hold on her. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but now the voices were no longer calling her name. They were taunting her, laughing, mocking her. She reached out with shaking fingers toward the door, as if the simple act of opening it could release her. But the moment she stepped toward it, the door slammed shut again with a deafening bang. Eleanor screamed, and for the first time since she had arrived, she realized that Hill House wasn't just a house. It was something far darker, far older. It had a life of its own, a terrible, unrelenting force that would never let her go. And as the whispers filled her ears once more, Eleanor knew deep down she was trapped. The house had won. The house was silent. The kind of silence that was thick, oppressive, as though it absorbed sound and light alike. Eleanor stood motionless in the center of the hallway, feeling the weight of the house bearing down on her, pressing her shoulders, her chest, until she could barely breathe. Every creak of the floor beneath her feet, every distant groan of the walls seemed magnified, deafening in its stillness. It was as though the house itself was watching her, studying her, waiting for her to make the first move. Her pulse quickened, her skin crawling with the unnerving sensation that something was terribly wrong. Her every instinct screamed at her to flee, to escape, but there was nowhere to run, no way out. The house seemed to stretch on forever, its endless rooms and twisting corridors trapping her in its cold embrace. She tried to steady her breathing, but the air felt thick, like she was suffocating. The house was alive in a way she couldn't explain, couldn't understand. A shadow flickered in the corner of her vision, and she whipped her head around, eyes wide with terror. But when she looked, there was nothing there. Nothing but the cold, empty hallway stretching out before her. Still, her heart raced. She could feel something watching her, something moving just beyond her sight. She took a cautious step forward, her shoes scraping faintly against the floor. Her fingers brushed against the cold wall, and she could feel the house shudder beneath her touch, like it was responding to her every movement. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she reached the first door on her left. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Eleanor could see nothing but darkness. It felt wrong. Something inside that room, something unseen, was calling to her, but she wasn't sure if she should answer. Then the sound came, a low, guttural growl, emanating from somewhere deep within the house. It echoed off the walls, vibrating through her bones, setting her teeth on edge. Eleanor's breath hitched, and her hand shot to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The sound was like nothing she had ever heard before. Animalistic, primal, full of rage and hunger. The growl rolled over her, through her, and she could feel the floor beneath her tremble in response. Without thinking, she backed away from the door, eyes fixed on the darkness within. She couldn't explain why, but she knew in her gut that she was not alone. Something was there, and it wasn't human. Eleanor spun around, her body frozen in place. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. She could only make out the outline, tall, thin, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching into the darkness. Its presence seemed to drain the very light from the hallway, turning the space into an inky black void. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Her heart hammered in her chest, her throat tightening as though the air itself was being sucked out of the room. She couldn't look away, couldn't breathe, as the figure began to move. Each step it took seemed to echo through the house, filling the space with an unnerving rhythm. But it didn't walk like a person. It glided, a faint, eerie float, as if it wasn't bound by the same rules of gravity as she was. Eleanor's legs were frozen, her body rigid with fear. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get away, but her body betrayed her, locking her in place. The figure, whatever it was coming closer, drawing nearer, its presence filling the entire hallway. Suddenly, the figure stopped, and Eleanor could feel her heart skip a beat. It was staring at her. She could sense its eyes on her, though she couldn't see them. The darkness between them seemed to pulse, and she could feel its gaze cutting through her, piercing her soul. The air grew heavier, colder, and she could feel the temperature drop, her breath becoming visible in front of her. Without a word, the figure raised one hand, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Slowly it pointed toward her, its long, bony finger trembling in the still air, and then a voice, low, rasping like dry leaves scraping together in the wind, spoke from the depths of the shadows. "You are here," it said, the words heavy with meaning, echoing in her mind. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The voice wasn't human. It was something older, something much older. She could feel it crawling inside her mind, twisting her thoughts, warping her reality. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, becoming more solid, more tangible, as though the darkness itself was closing in on her. The space between them seemed to shrink, and the walls of the house groaned in protest. Eleanor could hear the faint whispers again, filling the silence, swirling around her. "You are here," the voice repeated. "You belong here." And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. Eleanor's legs gave out beneath her, and she crumpled to the floor, her hands clutching at her chest as she gasped for air. Her heart was racing, the sound of it pounding in her ears, drowning out everything else. The room seemed to spin around her, the walls closing in, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone anymore, that the house was alive, watching, waiting. With shaking hands, she pushed herself up, taking tentative steps back down the hallway, her eyes darting in every direction. She could feel it now. The pressure, the presence. The house was alive, not just in the walls, but in the very air she breathed. She could feel its eyes on her, every step she took. The door to the room at the end of the hall opened by itself, the hinges creaking in protest. Eleanor froze, staring at the dark opening. Something in her mind told her not to go in there, not to cross that threshold. But the house was calling to her, pulling her toward it, urging her forward. With a trembling breath, Eleanor stepped closer. Her hand hovered over the doorframe, and for a moment she thought she saw something shift in the shadows within. A shape, just on the edge of her vision. She didn't dare move closer. But the door swung open wider, and she couldn't stop herself. She had to see what was inside. As she stepped over the threshold, the air changed. It grew colder, heavier, and the silence was so thick that she could feel it pressing on her, suffocating her. Her footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness of the room. But it was the silence, the unnatural stillness, that made her feel like she was being swallowed by it. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through the floor beneath her. It was subtle at first, like the sound of an old machine, but it grew louder, more insistent. Eleanor's heart raced again, her eyes darting around, searching for the source of the sound. And then she saw it. A mirror, standing in the far corner of the room. It was large, its frame ornate, covered in thick layers of dust. But what caught her attention wasn't the frame, it was what was reflected in the mirror. A figure. The same figure from before, but this time it was staring directly at her. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. The figure in the mirror smiled, a twisted, grotesque grin that stretched unnaturally across its face. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just grinned at her, its eyes gleaming with something far darker than any human could possess. And then the voice, raspy, cold, whispered from the shadows, "Welcome home, Eleanor." Eleanor screamed. The house was quieter than ever before, its silence hanging in the air like a thick fog. Eleanor stood motionless in the center of the dark room, her breath shallow, her body trembling. The mirror before her seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the reflection of the figure still locked in place, its twisted smile never wavering. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribcage, each beat deafening in her ears as she struggled to make sense of what was happening. Her fingers gripped the edge of the dusty wooden frame, the only thing keeping her grounded, keeping her from falling into the abyss that was the house. The figure in the mirror, her own reflection, yet not her own, stared at her, its eyes wide, unblinking. There was something so wrong about it, something so empty and hollow that Eleanor felt as though it was reaching into her soul, pulling at the very fabric of her being. The grin stretched wider, its grotesque smile beginning to split into something far more sinister. She couldn't look away, couldn't tear her eyes from the reflection, as if it had a hold on her, drawing her closer. Her pulse quickened, and she tried to move, to step back, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was rooted to the spot, as if the floor beneath her had turned to quicksand. The figure in the mirror tilted its head to one side, watching her with an eerie, knowing gaze, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. Then the room shifted, or rather, the space around her seemed to warp, as though reality itself was bending and distorting. The air grew thick, suffocating, as though she were trapped in a dream she couldn't wake up from. The mirror's surface shimmered, rippling like water, and for a split second, Eleanor thought she saw something else. Something moving within the reflection, something behind her. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the cold, empty room stretching out endlessly in all directions. Her breath hitched, and she turned back to the mirror. The figure was closer now, its face just inches away from the glass, its eyes locked onto hers. The air around her seemed to vibrate with a low hum, a deep, resonating sound that rattled her bones. The smile on the figure's face grew wider, more mocking, as if it knew something she didn't. Then a voice, low and chilling, slithered from the depths of her mind. "You're not alone here, Eleanor." The words echoed in her mind, a soft whisper that sent a jolt of cold fear through her body. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end as she scanned the room again, desperate for any sign of movement. But all was still, the silence once more pressing in on her from all sides. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "You're part of this now." The words were like a curse, each syllable a weight pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Eleanor felt a strange pressure building around her, as though the very walls of the house were pushing in, closing her off from the outside world. The mirror seemed to shimmer again, and in that instant, Eleanor saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A pair of hands, ghostly and translucent, reaching out from behind the reflection, stretching toward her. She stumbled back, gasping for air, her eyes wide with terror. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls narrowing, the space growing smaller, tighter. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't think. All she could do was stare at the reflection, at the hands reaching for her, their fingers just inches from the glass. The figure in the mirror laughed, an eerie, hollow sound that seemed to reverberate throughout the entire house. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she fought to break free from the trance the mirror had cast over her. She turned away from it, her feet moving instinctively, carrying her toward the door, but when she reached it, it wouldn't open. She tried again, pushing and pulling, but the door was stuck as if it had been sealed shut by some unseen force. Panic rose in her throat, her pulse racing as she backed away from the door, eyes darting around the room for any escape. The hum in the air grew louder, more intense, vibrating through the floor and up her spine. The walls groaned, and the house seemed to tremble with an ancient, malevolent energy. Eleanor turned to face the mirror again, feeling the pull, the draw, as though it was calling to her, pulling her in like a magnet. She wanted to run, to scream, but her body refused to obey. A sudden sound, louder now, echoed from the hallway behind her. A sharp metallic scrape, like nails on a chalkboard. She whirled around, her eyes wide, searching the darkness. But there was nothing there, no one, yet she could feel it, feel the presence, the weight of something invisible in the room with her. She could hear faint footsteps, soft at first, like a whisper of movement in the distance. Then they grew louder, closer, until the sound was right behind her. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. The air was still, but the sound, the feeling was undeniable. Something was watching her, and it was getting closer. The reflection in the mirror shifted again, and this time Eleanor saw something that made her blood run cold. The figure, no longer just a shadow, was stepping out of the mirror, its form shifting, twisting, like something inhuman, a nightmare taking shape. Its face was no longer smiling. Instead, it was contorted in rage, its mouth stretched open in a silent scream. The hands reached for her, their fingers stretching out from the mirror, grasping at the air, inching closer and closer. Eleanor took a step back, her legs shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, and she could feel its cold, unrelenting gaze piercing her, reading her every thought, every fear. She stumbled backwards, tripping over her own feet, and fell to the floor, her back hitting the cold wooden planks with a thud. The figure stepped fully into the room, its presence filling the space, blocking out the light, casting everything into a suffocating darkness. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears, her body frozen with terror as the figure loomed over her, its form twisting and shifting like smoke in the air. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again, its tone a mixture of amusement and malice. You belong to me now. Eleanor's mind raced, her heart hammering in her chest as she struggled to move, to break free from the grip of the house. The figure loomed closer, its fingers now inches from her face, and in a desperate panic she reached for anything that could save her. Her hand found a shard of broken glass on the floor, and with trembling hands she gripped it tightly. With a sharp cry, she swung the shard at the figure, but it passed right through it, as if the figure wasn't even there. It wasn't real. None of it was real. And then the figure leaned down, its face close to hers, its breath cold against her skin. Eleanor's vision blurred, her head spinning, and the world around her seemed to distort, as if she were falling into a void. The figure's lips parted, and the voice that came from it was a whisper, a hiss, as if it were right inside her mind. You will never leave. The room seemed to spin and everything went black. The house had become a living thing, breathing with the pulse of an unseen, malevolent force. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she staggered through the dimly lit hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. She could hear the walls groan, like the house itself was shifting, closing in on her. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak in the floorboards echoed in her mind, whispering of things just beyond her reach. Something was following her. She could feel it, lurking in the corners of the house, watching, waiting. She had to get out. She had to find a way to escape, to break free from the grip this cursed house had on her. The fear gnawed at her insides, each thought twisted and tangled in her head. The world around her seemed to bend, like the house was reshaping itself, trapping her in its unrelenting maze. Eleanor's eyes darted from one side of the hallway to the other, trying to find a familiar landmark, something that would guide her to the door, to freedom. But it was as if the house had no intention of letting her leave. Every turn she made seemed to lead her further into the unknown, deeper into its labyrinthine corridors. Her breath quickened, panic clawing at her throat, but she refused to stop. She couldn't let it consume her. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of movement. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze, every muscle in her body tense. The hallway was empty, silent, save for the faint sound of her own breathing. Yet that feeling, the one that told her she wasn't alone, intensified, crawling over her skin like 1,000 tiny insects. She turned sharply, expecting to see something, or someone, behind her, but there was nothing. The hallway stretched out, endless and cold, lit only by the dim flickering of the overhead lights. It was quiet. Too quiet. The silence was broken by a sudden sharp sound, like something scraping across the floor. Eleanor whipped around again, her heart hammering in her chest. The noise came from the end of the hallway, where the darkness seemed to press in tighter, like a shadow reaching for her. She took a cautious step forward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could feel the chill in the air, the way it seemed to thicken as she moved. With each step, the house felt more oppressive, its walls pressing in on her, its floorboards creaking beneath her feet like a warning. And then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a figure, just a silhouette at first, barely visible in the shadows. It stood still, watching her. Eleanor's pulse raced. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, silent and waiting. She knew that feeling, the one that twisted in her gut, that told her she should turn around and run. But she couldn't. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. Something drew her in, something deeper than fear, something primal. She took another step, then another, her feet almost dragging as she moved closer. The figure remained motionless, but Eleanor could feel the weight of its gaze on her, like it was reaching out with unseen hands, pulling her toward it. Her hand reached out, trembling, toward the wall, steadying herself. She needed to know. She had to know what it was. She had to confront it. The closer she got, the more the figure took shape, its features becoming clearer in the dim light. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the shape of the figure. It was her. It was her, standing at the end of the hallway, motionless, her face a twisted mockery of her own. She stumbled back, a scream rising in her throat, but no sound came. Her body was frozen, her legs refusing to move. The figure in front of her smiled, a cruel, mocking grin that stretched unnaturally wide. Her reflection, no, it wasn't her, wasn't human anymore. The eyes were dark, voids of endless black, swallowing all light. The mouth split open, revealing sharp teeth, jagged and unnaturally long. Suddenly the temperature in the hallway dropped, the air becoming frigid. Eleanor could see her breath as she gasped, the icy fog swirling around her. The figure in front of her took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, each footstep echoing loudly in the suffocating silence. She tried to move, to scream, but her body wouldn't obey. Her heart raced, thumping violently in her chest as she backed away. She could feel the presence of something else, something watching her from the darkness. A whisper, soft and cold, slipped into her ear. "You can't run from yourself, Eleanor." The voice sent a shiver down her spine. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty again, as if the figure had never existed. But Eleanor knew better. The house was playing with her. It was toying with her mind, bending reality around her. She could feel it, the tension in the air, the pressure of something unseen bearing down on her. Her breathing quickened, each exhale sharp and ragged as she stumbled backward, her eyes darting around, looking for an escape. She had to get out. She had to. But every direction she looked, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls narrowing, closing in on her. The lights above flickered, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. She pressed herself against the wall, her fingers gripping the cold, damp surface as she tried to steady herself. The voice came again, colder this time, seeping into her mind. "You can never leave." Her pulse quickened. The words echoed, reverberating in her skull like a drumbeat. She shook her head, trying to block them out, trying to break free from the grip the house had on her. But it was no use. It was like a vice, tightening around her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. A distant sound caught her attention, a soft thudding from somewhere deeper in the house. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, like footsteps. Someone, no, something was coming for her. Eleanor's body tensed, every muscle coiled with fear. She turned to run, but before she could move, the walls around her seemed to shift, the hallway twisting in unnatural ways, the doors slamming shut in front of her, trapping her. She was locked in, and the sound of footsteps continued, growing louder, more frantic, like something or someone was closing in on her. And then the whisper came again, this time louder, like it was right behind her, breathing down her neck. "You'll never escape. You're mine." Eleanor spun around, her eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there, only the darkness, only the cold. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps, the whispers, the presence, all gone. The house was once again silent, oppressive, like it was waiting for something. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to break free, but something held her in place, something invisible, something that gripped her heart and squeezed. She had to escape. But where? How? As her mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, she felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest, like a hand had reached in and squeezed her heart. Her vision blurred and she staggered forward, barely catching herself before collapsing to the floor. The house was alive, and it wasn't letting her go. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps as she clutched her chest, her pulse racing, her heart pounding louder and louder until it was all she could hear. And then the house spoke again, its voice cold and distant. "You're not alone." The room seemed to close in on her, the darkness swallowing her whole. Eleanor's breath came in short, ragged gasps, each inhale a struggle against the suffocating atmosphere of the house. The walls seemed to close in around her, their cold, oppressive presence like a vice, squeezing the very life out of her. Every flicker of light seemed to mock her, casting shadows that stretched longer, deeper, wrapping around her like tendrils of darkness. The sound of her heartbeat was deafening in her ears, drowning out everything else. She could feel it again, something watching her, something just beyond the edge of her perception. She tried to steady herself, but the very air she breathed seemed thick, like it was made of something far heavier than oxygen. The house had become a living thing, its every creak, every groan, a whisper, a beckoning. The darkness wasn't just outside of her. It was inside her mind, twisting her thoughts, making her question what was real. Was she losing her grip on reality? Or was the house truly alive? She didn't know anymore. Eleanor looked down at her hands, trembling as she wiped the sweat from her palms. They were slick, slippery, as if the house itself had soaked into her skin. She swallowed hard, trying to push the rising panic down, but it was no use. It was like the walls had ears, like the house could hear her thoughts, feeding on her fear, growing stronger with each passing second. She had to keep moving. She had to find a way out. The hallway stretched before her, a maze of twisted, distorted walls, the very architecture of the house contorting, shifting in on itself. No matter how many turns she took, she found herself back where she started, right here, in this cold, suffocating corridor. There was no escape, no way out. The house was playing with her, toying with her mind, like it had, toying with so many others before her. Eleanor could feel the weight of its history, the ghosts of its past pressing down on her. As her footsteps echoed in the silence, the soft sound of something scraping against the floor reached her ears. She froze. The noise was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, sharper, like nails dragging across wood. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't coming from behind her or from the room at the end of the hall. It was coming from within the very walls themselves. Her heart skipped a beat. The house was alive, alive in a way that defied logic. She had no idea what kind of madness she was stumbling into, but there was no denying it now. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked with unseen weight. Someone was here. And then there was a sound, a soft whisper. Barely audible at first, it seeped into the silence like poison, slithering into her mind. Eleanor? Her name. The voice was distorted, stretched, like it was coming from deep within the earth itself. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She turned sharply, looking over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the shadows. The darkness had taken shape. It was all around her now, closing in. The very air had become dense, thick with the weight of unseen things. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. Her chest tightened, and she had to fight for control, had to force her body to keep moving forward. But her feet felt heavy, each step like wading through water. The whisper came again, louder this time, sharper, more insistent. Eleanor! She wanted to scream, to run, but the house wouldn't let her. Her legs felt like lead, as if the very ground beneath her feet was trying to pull her down into the depths. She could hear something else now, a low, guttural sound. It was like a growl, deep and primal, coming from the very walls themselves. The house was feeding on her fear, and it was hungry. It wanted her. It needed her. Her breath quickened, her hands shaking as she clutched at her chest, trying to steady herself, trying to hold on to her sanity. But there was nothing to hold on to here, nothing except the suffocating presence of the house. The whispering grew louder, the growling deeper, until it was all she could hear, all she could feel. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a terrible, unseen force pushing against her, shoving her forward, forcing her to move. And then, there it was again, the scraping sound. It was closer now, closer than before, moving with a purpose, like something or someone was crawling through the walls toward her. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. She had to get away. She had to find a way out. But the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, its endless twists and turns leading her nowhere. The growl turned into a screech, a bone-chilling, high-pitched wail that made her skin crawl. It was the sound of something dying, of something being torn apart. The walls seemed to shake, as if the house itself were in agony. The air was so thick now, so suffocating that Eleanor could barely breathe. She had to get out. She had to... Eleanor! It was right behind her. The voice, that twisted, distorted voice, was right behind her, breathing down her neck. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty hallway, stretching out in every direction. Nothing. No one. The whisper came again, this time louder, more demanding. Eleanor? She could feel its presence now, like a cold breath on the back of her neck, a weight in the air, pressing against her. It was everywhere. The walls seemed to close in on her, the ceiling lowering, the floor buckling beneath her. The house was moving. The house was alive, and it was coming for her. The growling was louder now, echoing through the hall like a primal roar. It was like the house itself was alive with hunger, with a thirst that could never be quenched. She had to get out. She had to... And then, as quickly as it started, the growling stopped. The whispers stopped. The house went silent. But the silence was worse. The stillness was unbearable. Eleanor's heart thudded in her chest, the only sound in the room now. She tried to move, but her body felt frozen, her feet stuck to the floor like she was trapped in place. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. She couldn't stand it. She couldn't breathe. She needed to move. She needed to... A soft creak. And then, the floor beneath her shifted, as if something beneath the house was stirring. The walls groaned in protest, and Eleanor took a step back, her eyes wide, scanning the shadows, waiting for something to emerge. Something brushed against her leg. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat before she could stop it. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, still, but she could feel it. Feel the presence lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The silence returned, suffocating, unbearable. But it wasn't true silence. It was the silence before something terrible. Something was coming. Something was already here. And then, as the air grew colder, Eleanor heard the softest of whispers in her ear, a breath against her skin. "I'm here, Eleanor." The darkness deepened. Eleanor stood frozen, her pulse racing, her breath shallow and erratic. The darkness seemed to press in on her from all sides, thick and suffocating. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her, tracking her every move, and the fear crawled up her spine like icy fingers. The whisper, barely audible, had come from somewhere behind her, but when she turned, the hallway was empty. Empty, yet full of the palpable sense that something was there, just out of sight, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Her heart beat louder in her ears, each thud echoing through her skull. The silence in the house was unnerving, oppressive. It wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was a silence pregnant with menace, thick with an unseen presence that suffocated all other sounds. Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a slow, deliberate step forward. She couldn't stand here. She couldn't let the fear control her. But the moment she moved, the floor creaked beneath her, as if the house was aware of her every action. She froze. The floorboards groaned, a low, resonant sound that rattled her bones. She held her breath, waiting, straining her ears for any sound, any hint that she wasn't alone. But all she could hear was the wind, howling outside the walls, pressing against the house like a living thing trying to get in. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything that could give her a sense of control. The walls were cracked, peeling in places where the paint had long since faded, revealing the raw, weathered bones of the house. The furniture stood shrouded in dust, unmoving, their forms distorted in the dim light. The house seemed to breathe in time with her own ragged breaths. She wasn't sure if it was her mind playing tricks on her, but the longer she stayed here, the more she felt it. A presence, darker than the shadows, shifting and coiling, waiting to reach out and claim her. A faint, almost imperceptible sound broke the silence, a soft scraping, like nails against the wood. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She looked down, her body stiff with fear. Something was moving, something was... No, it couldn't be. The old house was alive with creaks and groans, its timbers shifting in the wind. But this was different. This was deliberate, slow, purposeful. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to flee, but her legs felt like they were trapped in concrete. She couldn't move. Not yet. She needed to understand what was happening. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning every corner of the hallway, every shadow, looking for the source of the noise. Then, in a moment of absolute stillness, she saw it. A shadow, a dark, thin shape, moving along the farthest wall. It was like a wisp of smoke, dark and malleable, shifting as though it were alive. It seemed to merge with the walls, melting into them before reappearing just a few feet closer. Her breath hitched. No, this wasn't possible. She didn't know whether to scream or run, but before she could move, the temperature in the air plummeted. A rush of cold so sharp, so sudden, it felt like a knife slicing through her skin. Goosebumps rose on her arms as the cold spread, filling the room like a fog, suffocating, numbing her fingers as she reached out to touch the wall. The shadow was closer now. Too close. It was a figure, a shape that seemed to pulse, to grow with each breath she took. Eleanor couldn't tear her eyes away. The shadow stretched, elongated, taking a form. Too many limbs, too many angles. The thing inside the shadow was crawling toward her, its movements twisted and unnatural. She could hear it now, a faint scratching noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like the sound of something dragging its body along the floor. Her hands shook as she reached out for the door, her only hope of escape. But when her fingers touched the handle, it was ice cold, colder than the air around her. She jerked her hand back, her breath caught in her throat. But the moment she moved, the shadow lunged. It wasn't a mere movement. It was a blur of motion, something that wasn't supposed to be. It crossed the space between them in an instant, and before she could react, it was there, just inches from her face, a thing that shouldn't exist. Eleanor's chest constricted, and her heart seemed to stop. A whisper. "You're not leaving." The voice was so close now, it was inside her mind. Eleanor's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. Her eyes were wide with terror as the shadow closed in, its form writhing, contorting, like it was made of smoke and nightmare. It hovered above her, a suffocating presence that stole the breath from her lungs. She wanted to scream, but her voice failed her. She had to get out. Had to escape. The door. She forced her body to move, to crawl toward it, but it felt like wading through water. Every inch felt like a struggle, every breath a fight for survival. The shadow reached out for her, tendrils of darkness wrapping around her, tugging her back toward the floor. The world tilted, and the hallway began to shift, to twist, as if the house itself were warping under the weight of the thing inside. Eleanor could feel it, could feel the house, its very structure, fighting against her, pulling her into its depths. The walls were closing in, the darkness enveloping her, consuming her, until there was nothing but her racing heart and the sound of her breath, shallow and panicked. And then, as quickly as it had come, the shadow was gone. The door was before her again. The house stood still, quiet, as though nothing had happened. The silence returned, but this silence was worse. This silence was thick, oppressive, a promise of more horror to come. Eleanor stumbled to her feet, her body shaking with the aftershock of the terror she had just experienced. She reached for the door again, this time with more force, her fingers curling around the cold metal, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she twisted the knob, the door stayed locked. She could feel the weight of something behind her, but when she turned, the hallway was empty. Empty except for the shadows that seemed to stretch farther, reach farther, as if they were closing in. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. "I told you, you're not leaving." The floor beneath her feet shifted again, groaning, as if the house itself were alive, feeding off her fear. Eleanor's pulse hammered in her chest, her head spinning. She could feel the cold, feel the breath of whatever it was that waited for her in the shadows. She had no way out, no escape. And then she heard it again, the sound of scraping nails, closer than ever coming from within the walls. And then, louder than before, a low, guttural growl. The house was waking up, the darkness was alive, and it was hungry. The house wasn't just a building. It was a trap, a prison, and Eleanor was its next victim. As the growl grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the very foundation of the house, Eleanor could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, as though the house itself was about to devour her whole. There was no escape, no hope. Only the dark, suffocating grip of the house, pulling her under, swallowing her whole. And all she could do was listen. Listen to the growl, listen to the scrape, listen to the house. And as she fell to the floor, unable to move, unable to breathe, she realized, with a sickening certainty, that she was never leaving. Not alive anyway. The shadows would have her now. Empty, empty except for the shadows that seemed to stretch farther, reach farther, as if they were closing in. The whisper came again, faint but unmistakable. "I told you, you're not leaving." The floor beneath her feet shifted again, groaning, as if the house itself were alive, feeding off her fear. Eleanor's pulse hammered in her chest, her head spinning. She could feel the cold, feel the breath of whatever it was that waited for her in the shadows. She had no way out, no escape. And then she heard it again, the sound of scraping nails, closer than ever, coming from within the walls. And then, louder than before, a low, guttural growl. The house was waking up, the darkness was alive, and it was hungry. The house wasn't just a building, it was a trap, a prison, and Eleanor was its next victim. As the growl grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the very foundation of the house, Eleanor could feel the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, as though the house itself was about to devour her whole. There was no escape, no hope, only the dark, suffocating grip of the house, pulling her under, swallowing her whole. And all she could do was listen. Listen to the growl, listen to the scrape, listen to the house. And as she fell to the floor, unable to move, unable to breathe, she realized with a sickening certainty that she was never leaving. Not alive, anyway. The shadows would have her now. The wind howled outside, its mournful cry seeming to echo through the decaying halls of Hill House. Inside, Eleanor stood in the middle of the grand hallway, her mind reeling, her body trembling with the terror that had yet to subside. The walls around her seemed to close in, pulsating, as if the house itself were alive, breathing, waiting. Her every step felt like it was being watched. Her every move calculated by unseen eyes. She could feel the weight of something darker than the shadows pressing in on her. The silence now was worse than any noise. Every floorboard creak, every subtle groan of the house beneath her feet was a reminder of how fragile her grip on reality was. Was she truly alone? She had no idea anymore. The world outside had ceased to exist in any meaningful way. There was only Hill House, its oppressive, suffocating presence, and the ever-growing sense that something malevolent was circling, waiting for the right moment to strike. She turned to face the hallway, her breath catching in her throat as she caught a fleeting glimpse of movement, just a flicker, a shadow darting around the corner. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat and she instinctively took a step back, her body reacting before her mind could process the threat. She wanted to run, but her feet felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the spot by some invisible force. As her eyes darted around, searching the shadows, she could hear it. Soft at first, like a distant whisper, then growing louder with each passing second. It was a voice. Low, guttural, indistinguishable, a mere murmur of unintelligible words. The words were not meant for her ears, not for any human ears. The voice, if it could even be called that, seemed to resonate from deep within the walls themselves, vibrating the very structure of the house, forcing Eleanor's skin to crawl. With a shaky breath, Eleanor forced herself to move forward, unable to stand in the same spot any longer. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to find the exit, but where was the way out? Every turn she made led deeper into the heart of the house, further from any hope of escape. Her mind reeled with questions. What was this place? What had happened to the others who had walked through these cursed halls before her? Was she becoming part of this house, its endless cycle of torment? She stumbled into the library, a room that seemed untouched by time. The grand bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dusty tomes and leather-bound volumes. It was strangely serene compared to the chaos of the hallways, yet that only made it more unsettling. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, studying her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake. As she stepped deeper into the room, her eyes landed on a large ornate mirror on the far wall. The reflection seemed distorted, the edges blurry, as though something was moving just out of sight, a presence just beyond her reach. She could feel her pulse quicken, her breath becoming shallow. She couldn't help herself. Her eyes were drawn to it, to the reflection of herself that seemed somehow wrong. Her figure appeared just as she was, yet there was something strange about her eyes. Something empty, something not quite human. Eleanor took a step closer to the mirror, her hand trembling as she reached out. She touched the cold glass, and the room seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, thicker, and the darkness at the edges of the mirror seemed to draw closer, seeping outward like ink in water. Suddenly she could hear the whispers again, louder now, coming from inside the mirror itself. With a jolt, Eleanor pulled her hand away from the glass, but it was too late. The whispers had grown into something more, louder, more insistent. It was as if the house was alive, speaking to her, calling to her. A chill ran down her spine as she realized with a sickening clarity that the mirror wasn't just reflecting her image. It was a gateway, a portal into something else, something far worse. She backed away from the mirror, her eyes never leaving its surface. The whispers were now accompanied by an unbearable pressure in her chest, a sensation of something crawling beneath her skin, just beneath the surface, pushing against her, trying to get out. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but the air was thick, oppressive, suffocating, as if the house itself were forcing her into silence. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind her. Eleanor spun around, her heart leaping into her throat as she caught sight of a shadow moving across the floor, a dark figure, its shape obscured by the darkness. She could feel it, closing in on her. The figure didn't move like a person. It slithered like something twisted, something unnatural. Its presence seemed to stretch outwards, filling the room, blotting out the light, until there was nothing but darkness. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and she could see her breath misting in front of her face. And then it was gone. Eleanor's legs trembled, her body stiff with fear, but she could not afford to stop moving. She had to keep going. The house was alive, and it would not let her leave. Every moment in Hill House felt like an eternity, each corner a new danger, each room a new nightmare. There was nowhere safe, nowhere to hide. Her mind began to unravel, thoughts tumbling over one another, each one more fragmented and disjointed than the last. She couldn't tell what was real and what was a product of the house's malevolent influence. Had the shadow really been there? Was she losing her mind, or was the house simply playing with her? She couldn't know. All she could do was keep moving, keep searching for a way out, even though she knew deep down that there was no escape. Not for her. With every step, the house seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The corridors stretched longer, the shadows darker, and the sense of foreboding intensified. She reached another door, the knob cold to the touch, but as she turned it, the door didn't budge. It was locked. Locked from the other side. She twisted the knob harder, pulling with all her strength, but still, nothing. She pressed her ear against the door, listening, straining to hear any sound. It was only then that she noticed it. A low, guttural sound coming from within the room. It was almost like breathing. Slow, deep breaths, as though something was waiting on the other side, its presence heavy, suffocating. Her hands shook, but she couldn't stop herself. She couldn't leave the door unopened. She had to know what was inside. With a final, desperate pull, the door gave way, swinging open with a sudden force. Eleanor's heart stopped. The room was dark, but she could make out the shape of a figure, slumped against the far wall, unmoving. A low, unnatural hum filled the air, vibrating through her bones, and she stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the air growing colder, the darkness thicker. The figure, it wasn't human anymore. The closer she got, the more distorted the shape became, its edges blurring, melting into the darkness. Eleanor's stomach churned, and she tried to pull away, but something gripped her, an invisible force holding her in place, drawing her closer. The figure stirred, its head jerking up in an unnatural motion. A face. But it was not a face she recognized. It was hers. Her reflection, twisted and wrong, staring back at her with hollow eyes, its lips curling into a sinister smile. The voice returned, louder now, from the very walls themselves. "You cannot leave. You belong here with us." The room was closing in, the darkness pressing on her from all sides. Eleanor screamed, but the scream was drowned out by the deafening silence that followed. The house had her now. There was no escape.